Hi, class. Welcome back. This is week 6. Before we start the class, we're going to speak about chapter 5, which is chapter 5. We will be talking about a few things. First of all, I'm working on your test, so hopefully I can get back to you sometimes a week from this class. The second thing, I've sent you an email. In the email, I've usually put you in a group. So please keep that group and start talking to each other because there was assignment is coming in as a group assignment. So you need to work with your group on this assignment. So you need to stay in contact with them. Third thing, you have done wonderful things in the Padlet, so keep the good work. And every week I will be posting a new Padlet, so look forward for it, and hopefully we can keep the good work also. Uh, the other thing that uh, we will do some other extra activities, which is called a flip grid. And in the flip grid, you will probably would have some question and you need to answer it. There will be more material this week only because you need to know more about the flip grid and other issues of the thing. So without further ado, we will start chapter 5 and please go through the material that I posted for you, all of them, so you can have a good grip and good understanding of with the macroeconomics. Let me share my screen with you. Okay. Here we go. Today we will be talking about the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We spoke about demand and supply and how the equilibrium happening between the demand and supplies with considering the pricing and all these things. Today we'll talk about more macroeconomics, which is aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Now, in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, the concept we need to learn objectives like explaining the concept of potential GDP, the business cycles, the source of economic growth. We're also going to explain the concept and the aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and the macroeconomics. Um, we're also going to talk about uh, we're going to describe the factor that can affect the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply. Um, List the cause of recession and inflationaries or inflation booms. Explain the main point of disagreement, and that's how I put it in the video, about between the neoclassical and Keynesians. So you probably need to know neoclassical, and you can understand what's Keynesians all about, and explain the modern view of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, driven from these two ideas. So there is the neoclassical, there is the Keynesians, and there is a modern view of all the economies. So you see that the economic theories are set, and you need to derive your analysis and the future from it. Now, let me try to explain from the basic thing. So, the production possibilities. What's the production possibilities? Is production possibility represent the high point at all the cases. So when there is a consumer goods and capital goods available, the production possibilities is, with the loading capital goods, you will have more consumers goods. So the PP1 represent the highest possible production level. Now moving from point A to point B in the consumer goods is showing that increase in the actual production. So the production is happening in the shifting things from one side to another. Now, here the movement from point A to point B is same, but the economy has more room to grow for an increase of sustainable. The demand or the movement from point A production says, for example, if you have a machine, for example, a good example, and it can produce 100 units, but right now you're producing 20, that does not mean it cannot produce 100, and it keeps shifting one by one until it reaches 100 units. So there is a potential for that machine. So is the GDP. There is a potential GDP we're talking about. This is one of way of looking at the potential GDPs. Now, potential GDP is the total amount that economy is capable of producing when all its sources is fully utilized. Just like we said about the machine. So potential GDP is what you call in this graph. You're going to see it is this is the potential GDP. That's the all. Let's assume everybody is working full time. All the minerals and resources are fully utilized. This is what you call a full potential GDP, and has no depend on the price level. So it's a different than aggregate supply and aggregate demand, different than supply and demand. The price goes higher or lower, it affects the demand and supply. Here, the potential GDP which is the gross domestic product, has a one level and does not shift back and forth unless there is other condition that involved with it. So that's what you call the potential GDP. And what we are operating, for example, now is say at a real GDP. This is what you call whether potential or a real GDP. So here, it's the same level. Now, when economy grow, the GDP also grow with it. So the source that affect the potential GTV or long-term aggregate supply. So there is a long-term aggregate supply or LAS, where the potential GDP are kind of equal. The source that affected is the quantity and the quality of labor resources. Quantity is number of the people who's working, and the quality is how well educated at the level of a human capital. That's unhuman. When it comes to the amount of physical capital good available, like land for, growing crops or something, these are amount of physical capital good available. Rate of technology changes. Technology affected the rate of one farmer, if it used to in 10 years ago produce 10 units, because of the technology, same one farmer produce 100. So the technology is affecting the productions, which is affecting the supplies, the long-term aggregate supplies, which is affecting the potential GDPs. Now, the amount of a quantity of natural resources, and you see some countries now suddenly find some gas, and this gas can give a jump in their growth. 10 years ago in Canada, they found lots of oil, and this give a jump in their growth also. Now, so on average, Canada potential GDP grew by 3% per year since 1990s. So an average of 3 years, 3% every year has been growing. And its cause reason of the growth is this one. These are the points that we went through them, or combination of them, or some of them. Now, in a business cycle, we always going to go through, you heard the expansionary or expansion, and contractionary or contraction. So the business is booming and business is declining. These are the cycles that always going to be there. So when it's this happening, GDP growth varies from one year to another year. So this is where we will see like some peak time and expansion is happening in the peak, and then it's a recession and drops in the real GDP, the growth GDP, and it keeps moving up and down because of the business cycle. Now, let's talk about aggregate supplies. Aggregate supplies means that the aggregate quantity of goods and services produced by all sellers at the various price levels. So at the X price, there is all the suppliers, how much they produce, 10 units, for example. At the Y price, all the suppliers produce 50 units. So the whole thing, that's what you call aggregate supply. a price, a higher price level, normally with the wage remaining constant, will increase the profit for companies or for the firm. And that makes the company wants to produce more. So the aggregate supplies increases. A lower price level implies that companies make a lower profit, and in the lower level of profit, the output will be lower because they're not interested to produce more. There's not more company is getting established to produce, also to add on in the production. So the aggregate supply, as you see, a higher price results in the great quantity of aggregate supply. So the higher the price it is, the aggregate supplies goes higher. Now, even with the aggregate supplies it goes higher, the GDP, if the salary is constant, will stay, will growth. Now, we have other points. We're trying to put few points that you need to know, and then we put them all together to easy for us to explain what these the classical and Keynesian and neoclassical or neo theories means. If we need to explain these issues for you before we get into explaining the theories. So, what's a real wage versus the nominal wage? A real wage is the amount of good and service that an employee can buy for a given amount of nominal wage. And this is, you probably practice it when you are in a city. Things is more expensive than you are in a village, and the salary is the same. In the city, you can buy less than in the village. Same thing with a country to a country. So this is its amount of good and service that an employee can buy for a given amount of nominal wage. Now, what's a nominal wage? So that's a real wage. What's a nominal wage? Is the present day value of current wage. How much is uh, your wage? It is 10,000, 5,000, 4,000. So the real wage is the nominal wage over the price level. So we know the higher is the price, your real wage goes down. The lower is the price, the real wage goes up because of this calculation. So here where we have an aggregate supply, as the prices raises, we said that and or the nominal wage falls, the real wage declines because we know the real wage is this one. As the prices increases, the real wage is decline. So as the price is rises or the nominal wage falls, the real wage decline. Now, producers' real wage cost is declining, resulting in a higher profit. So when the producers um, um, uh, will be making more profit because the prices goes up or the real wage is going down and due to the because the prices is going up, so that's it will cause an increase in aggregate supplies, so there would be a shift in the aggregate supplies as the prices goes higher now because they are making more profit or because their real wage is declining. Now, the aggregate demand, the total quantity of final goods and service that consumers, business, government, and those living outside the country would buy at a various level. And it's very easy here. You can see is the fact that the aggregate demand at the price of so and so at this level and keeps as the price is going lower, the aggregate demand goes down, prices goes down. So it is keeps falling, and as the price goes higher, the demand for certain product goes lower. So P1 is a higher level, higher prices than the P3 here. So we notice here that because P1 demand is higher, when the price is going higher, the demand gets lower here. So the total quantity of a final good and services that consumer business and government and those living outside the country would buy at a various level of prices. Now, so we saw that the aggregate demand curve has downward slope. So that means downward slope is like this is a downward slope, it's going downward. And aggregate demand has a downward slope because of the real balance effect. When the lower the real wealth cause people to spend less because they are less rich, they spend less. Interest rate effect has uh, has uh, um, uh, higher cause, uh, higher interest rate will lead to a lower investment because high prices, uh, people who companies does not save money, they just want to invest more and more, and the higher interest rate will people borrow less money, so they're not going to spend more. And the foreigner trade effect, the higher the price make Canadian export less attractive because the prices is more expensive. When you take it to outside Canada, it becomes more expensive and is less attractive for the people outside. Now let's see the how this, as we spoke in the earlier chapters, we saw that there is a demand and supply. They have an equilibrium level at a certain price. Now that's equilibrium level is the real GDP also. A situation which in the aggregate quantities, so the aggregate quantities, a demand equal with the aggregate quantity supplied. Here is the equilibrium point where the aggregate demand and aggregate supplies is equilibrium met, and this is the P3, which is a certain level of price. Now, as the price above the equilibrium, a surplus will cause a procedure to drop the prices. So let's say the price at P2, and in the P2, the demand is less and the suppliers is usually higher, as we explained in earlier chapters. Now, the aggregate demand and aggregate supplies is also the same effect. And there is a surplus, there is more supplies. So the demand is less. Eventually, they have to downward pressure. They suppliers will consume, will put less and productions, and they will meet the equilibrium level. Now, At the price level very low, we will have a shortage because people have a purchase power and they want to buy more, and there is less supply because the prices is low and the profit is low. So the what's call the suppliers will be supplying less, so the demand is less, and there is a shortage here, as you see. So at equilibrium, at the price below the equilibrium, a shortage will cause buyers to bid up the price because the price is low and people have a better, more money. They will buy more and start bidding up, and the supplier will increase the price of that. You need to sit and analyze each one, understand it well, because most of the economics goes understanding real graphics, how it works. Um, in the full employment, whereas the supply and demand are equal, if the equilibrium occurs at a level of a long, we said the long run aggregate supply, LAS, and the economy is full employment. So where the AS and AD meet at a certain level, where there is a full employment equilibrium happening. So this is the long run aggregate supplies. This is where the full equilibrium is occurring, because any shift in onward or outward, meeting these two things outside or inside, will not be really kept for a long time and will be shift back or forth. So if the equilibrium occurs at the level of a long-term supplies, LAS, and the economy is at full equilibrium or full employment. I'm sorry, full employment. Now, in the recessionary gaps, if the equilibrium happening below the long aggregate supplies, there is a recessionary gap. If the demand is happening at here, meeting the suppliers, aggregate demand and aggregate suppliers meeting here, and the long-term aggregate supply is here, or the real GDP. So we're talking about a recession because there is a chance of a real GDP here, but for some reason it's shifting. We'll talk about it, why it's shifting in. If this occurs for two consecutive years, 2 years happen in a row, and then this is where you have a recession. A recession, sometimes, you see that there is a potential for this, back to that machine, to produce us 100, but we are producing at 50. So that's a recession. But if we produce more, that's inflationary, and we look at the recession better. So the machine is producing less here. Now, in the inflationary gap is the fact that these two are shifting is outside, where there is a higher demand for product and products, and consumers are willing to pay for it, and suppliers are willing to supply at that price. And it is that what's in the inflationary gap, which is it is long-term aggregate supplies. There is a shift happening, and this, as you can see, sometimes there is inflation in one country, and there is a neighborhood country will be shifting their product there because is the prices is getting really high as a short term, but in the long run term, the long aggregate supply will be adjusted. Now, let's understand, let's test what you're understanding. What is the equilibrium level of a price and real GDP? So we are focusing on really these two things, aggregate demand and aggregate supplies. So at 100 and 1100 is 110. If these are equal, then we will find out the price as 100. When it goes lower the price, you will see the aggregate supply demand is higher and aggregate supply is going lower. So if the price goes 95, there is a shortage or surplus. Do we have a shortage or surplus? So if it's a 95, you see the aggregate demand is higher and the aggregate supply is lower. So there is shortage, and because the price is lower, and is a shortage of 125, which is you subtract the aggregate demand from aggregate supply. So how we determines of aggregate demand? Aggregate demand get determined by individual consumer wealth. How wealthy is the consumer? How much is willing to spend? The age of consumers durables and the consumer expectation. What's their expectations? Now, determinants of aggregate demand depend on the change in the investment. So if the interest rate is high, people will borrow less, and when they borrow less, they buy less. The purchase price, installation, and maintenance cost affect cost of capital goods. How much is this cost to do that? The age of the age of capital goods and the amount of spare capacities, the business expectation, whether it's going to be more demand, more need, or not. So then the business goes and buy to produce more. Here is the business is more as a consumer to buy the other thing. And the government regulation, which is we will talk about how the government regulation affect the consumptions. Now, it's also the net export. When the value of exchange rate is, say, the dollar, Canadian dollars, Canadian American, we spoke about that, higher or lower will definitely affect the amount of exchange rate. I mean, exchange rates is being affected, and then amount of export, net export. Income level abroad, how rich is the our neighbors who we are exporting to them, are also affecting the price of the competitive goods, whether local or the foreigner. If the foreigner is cheaper, we have a tendency of buying more foreigners, so our import will be more than the export. And taste of foreigners, whether they like our milk or our products or potatoes, or they don't like it, that's a taste of the foreigners. How much is government spending? Are they spending on infrastructures, spending on education? These are more, affect the economy. And the tax rate, how much is being taxed, and what's the money supplies in the market, or just, that will help in the, spending. So let's see whether you understood what is the aggregate demand and the shift in it. A decrease in a stock market index will lower the aggregate demand, because decrease in the stock means some money was moving the hand, went out, went somewhere else, destroyed, for example, went to the prices went down. So it will lower the aggregate demand. An increase in the interest rate, people will buy less because they don't want to borrow more. So that's will decrease in aggregate demand. A decrease in government spending means people have less money, so there will decrease in buying. An increase in foreigner income, because they are importing more goods now from us, and a decrease in exchange rate uh, will increase our export, and will be people buying more from us, so that will we have more money and aggregate demand is going higher. So These are the things that you probably will hear it from the news. Sometimes you need to check the news, the economy section, and then try to understand these information and apply it to the daily news of in India or in China or in Canada or USA. I will also try to supply you with these information. Now, to determine long-term aggregate supplies, here is a change in a human capital. Suddenly, the country becomes rich. A change of the amount of the capital. In a human capital, I'm sorry, in a human capital, when the country like Canada from 27 million grows to 40 million population, that's a human capital production, more export, more money exchange. Now, long-term supply, a change in the amount of capital. So I'll find the oils or find the gas and all the technology changes. We spoke about it in the farmers 10 years ago, how much they can, one farmer produce 1 ton. And now one same farmer produce 10 tons because the technology changes. A change in natural resource, suddenly there was lots of oil. They found out about it or something, gas or situation. Now, an improvement in any of these determines a shift of both uh, aggregate supply and long-term aggregate supplies. So, it will, first of all, will shift um, aggregate supplies to aggregate supply too, because there is more wealth or there's more factories or the factory produce more. But in the long term, because the price is sticky, you will have a shift in the real GDP. It's very simple. People migrating to Canada, more manpower, more producing, more money. There is a growth in the aggregate supply. And once in the aggregate supply growth, there is a growth in the potential GDP. Now, a drop in the price of a factory shift only as aggregate supplies to the right, long term is not affected. So if there is a prices goes down for a shift in the short term, these are only aggregate supply will supply less in the short term, and the real GDP is sticky, not moving. But you need to, once the aggregate supply is shifting and aggregate demand is shifting, then aggregate demand is shifting, then these all becomes an equilibrium with the long-term supplies. You need to take a look at it more, try to understand how the real GDP, grows. And the growth we said well, how it's growing through increase in the human resources, technology, export, or capital resources. Now let's see an increase in the price of imported oil, what will happen to it? The aggregate supply, it lowers because the cost of production is going higher, and the cost of production that will affect the production itself. Now, an increase in the number of immigrants, more immigrants. So we see that the aggregate supplies is shift, it's more aggregate, more demand. People are more, so there's more supply for them, and eventually the long-term aggregate supply will shift. The discovery of oil deposit in Canada, also it does the same thing, affect the both things. And a substantial increase in wage settlement in the short term is just will decrease the aggregate supplies because some cash is moving out from the producers to hand of the employees. Um, the introduction of microchips that reduce the computer processing time by 80%. You have to know one thing, aggregate supplies is different than the long-term aggregate supply. So we might see a shift back and forth with the aggregate supply because of the prices of fluctuation. But there is a certain level as the machine can produce 100 units, there is certain level that GDP can stick there, and there is certain things affecting the real GDP, affecting the GDP in general and potential GDP, and these are will be affecting the long-term aggregate supply. So potential GDP is another word, a long-term aggregate supply. But overall, there is something called a multiplier. When the spending independently change, total income change more, and some of the income is spent again. So this is why you see the government spending. The more money comes in, the total income changes, the more spending. For example, here, if we are increasing the $10 increase in investment, somebody from foreigner countries or the government invested $10 in the country. Now, this $10, if we have 40% of it, people saving it, so it goes 4% increase in taxes and saving and import. That goes out, is like out of the economy. What remaining is $6. This goes back again into increase in the consumption because we're buying with that $6 in consumption. So this $6 goes back to the economy, which is becomes a $6, and this $6 once again partially goes to the tax saving and imports, and partially goes to again consumption, more consumption, and this is until reach to, it keeps going on. So this is what you call when a spending multiplier, because if I have a $10, say example, I go and buy food with the $6. Out of this $10, probably I'm saving $3, and one in bank, $1 I'm putting it, paying taxes in it, and some of it. Then the person who got this money, the $6, he goes also buy food and save some of it, and also uh, buying that food with the $3, and it keeps going on just like what's happening here in the multiplier. So increase in the aggregate demand, in aggregate demand, definitely we know that it raised the price and it raised the real GDP. So an increase in aggregate demand raised both prices and real GDP, because when aggregate demand increase, there is more productions happening to meet that aggregate demand, and also will increase also the prices. Now, increase in aggregate supply, the higher real GDP allow lower prices. So a change in the price of factory of production will shift the aggregate supply curve, resulting in increase in the GDP but fall in the real prices. So there's more productions happening. The more production is happening, the lower is becomes the prices. Now, a higher real GDP and a lower price. So you see, here's the difference: increase in I'm sorry, increase in aggregate demand and increase in aggregate demand raise the both the price and the GDP, real GDP. But increase in aggregate supplies raise the GDP and lower the price. Now, let's talk about Keynesian and neoclassical theory. In the Keynesian and neoclassical theory, the market is competitive and efficient. The neoclassical theory again says the market is competitive and efficient. There's invisible hand does fix the prices, that fix the wage, fix everything. Price and wage adjust rapidly to a surplus or shortage as aggregate supply is the same as potential GDP, and the economy always remain at the full employment. The new classical view, it says that um, if you notice here, the new classical, we said that the market is competitive and efficient. Price on wages adjusted rapidly to the surplus and shortage, and there's always adjustment, and increase in aggregate supply is the same as increase in the potential GDP because they look at the supplies, and economy is always at full-time employment. So here's you see the GDP, the real GDP, and increase in aggregate demand. The price level only increases the price level because the real GDP is stays and doesn't change, and you have any change in aggregate demand, this will change only. Now, in the Keynesian, it's also used the new classical, but it has a certain shift in it. Now, the video will be more telling you what's in the future of shift, what's more deeper. So if you want to get more understanding of this, you probably need to look at the YouTube video that I'm going to attach. The market is not very competitive due to the market power of corporations and unions and monopoly, oligopolies, and all these things. So the market is not perfect. The price and wages are sticky. They when they go price higher, it's very difficult to lower them. And also when the salary is higher, it's sticky. It doesn't change very smooth. Aggregate supply is horizontal at the current level of price. So at certain level of price, the aggregate supply becomes a horizontal and it's not growing as the market growth. And the government intervention sometimes is required because the aggregate supplies, if it's not growing like this, then as it becomes a horizontal, you need to there is some government shifting intervention happening, which is can help aggregate supplies to keep growing. In the Keynesian theory, it says that an increase in aggregate demand increases the real GDP. As we said, the more aggregate demand, the more increase the GDP. In the new classical says the increase in the aggregate supply increase the real GDP. So one of them looks at the different one. In the modern view theory, it used, let's say, it says both is true, but both are the same, similar when it comes the economy is growing and in a safe zone. But when this start the inflation or start the recession, strong recession, there where the classical theory does not work, and you need to get into Keynesian. So you need to shift your theory to manage the economy. So the modern view theory says the impact of the change in aggregate demand depends on the condition of the economy. If it's really normal economy, different than if it's in a recession. In a big recession, there is a big effect on the GDP as at the close, the potential GDP, they will affect more inflationaries. So in a recession, the economy acts Keynesian. Close to potential GDP, the economy acts neoclassical. We said that here where the economy acts neoclassical, and once it becomes a flat, here the economy start working more Keynesian, and you need to have a government intervention so you can grow this part of it. See the video, you will have a better understanding, more deeper understanding, because here I'm talking about at your level of presentations. Now in that video is more advanced information, but it's more, get to know how these two theories works. So the key concept to remember: what's a real potential GDP, what's the source of economic growth are, the idea of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and how they generate macroeconomics equilibrium, and the determinants of aggregate demand and aggregate demand, and the effect of the multipliers, spending, the cause of recession and inflation boom, what will happen. And then we have the three theory, Keynesian, neoclassical, and a combination of these two, which is modern views of the economies. So by now, we have finished uh, this chapter, and hopefully be able to see you on the next chapter and do your homework. Bye bye.